I don't celebrate Christopher Columbus. Any right-thinking person who actually goes on Google will find out the atrocities that he committed. I celebrate my immigrant family. Columbus Day was not originally created to honor Christopher Columbus. It was created as a day of remembrance for the victims of a massacre.
Hi, Mom.
Hello, child.
So we've got Columbus Day coming up, and Columbus Day, the federal holiday, has become a flashpoint for the culture war, largely surrounding the legacy of Christopher Columbus himself, which is worth talking about. But there's actually a lot more to the history of the formation of Columbus Day that is worth discussing. It's a violent and bloody history. It involves issues of race, class, power, the genocide of indigenous peoples, the barbaric inhumanity towards immigrant communities, and it brings up questions about who gets invited to participate in the American story and why. And this history is filled with things we are still confronting today. It's why the federal government has waged war on cities in America. Tell me about why you wanted to talk about Columbus Day.
I have always felt the weight of history on my shoulders for my own family and their history as immigrants. I feel the weight to tell their story in a way that they wanted to get away from. But that story came out, in hushed conversations between the old people as they talked in Italian, and my mother explained what they were talking about, and my grandmother, in unguarded moments. And I don't think that history should be forgotten. And I wanted to talk about what I found out about how the holiday started, which was very shocking to me. I think it's important not to forget it.
When you were growing up, being an Italian American, what did Columbus Day mean to you as a kid?
Oh, we loved Columbus Day. I mean, we got school off. We had St. Patrick's Day too, but that wasn't a national holiday. Only Italians got the national holiday. So we marched in the parade, and, Italians are very proud of Columbus Day. At that time, I knew very little about Christopher Columbus. It really wasn't about Columbus. I knew a little about him. We had a poem that he sailed the ocean blue in 1492 for Spain. But he was Italian, so we get the holiday. We knew a little about how bad a person he was, but that didn't dampen. I mean, everyone loves a parade. So as I got older and I found out more about Christopher Columbus, the man, who was an evil, awful man, a sex trafficker and committed genocide on native peoples who wouldn't comply with him. And it's just barbaric. I understood that a lot of people really didn't want to celebrate a day called Columbus Day. But still, it's a very important day for Italian Americans. And I came across the actual history of how the holiday got started pretty much by accident when I was trying to figure out how Italian Americans became accepted as white in America. And I have to tell you, the story of Columbus Day is really shocking. And I think it needs to be told so that we as Italian Americans don't forget what happened to us once upon a time as immigrants in this country.
Yeah, when we were doing our episode about immigration and you were researching the history of the treatment of Irish and Italian immigrants in America, because Irish people, Italian people weren't always considered to be white. But at some point that changed. And in looking into that story, you came across this truly sort of horrific story that took place in Louisiana in the 1800s.
Columbus Day was not originally created to honor Christopher Columbus. It was created as a day of remembrance for the victims of a massacre, for the victims of the greatest mass lynching in the history of the United States. 11 Italian immigrants were broken out of a jail by a mob, ginned up by politicians and oligarchs, dragged out of the jail and lynched and desecrated. I think that story is really important to tell. After the Civil War, tens of thousands of Sicilians and people from southern Italy immigrated to Louisiana, particularly to New Orleans. I had no idea that there was a huge community of Italians in New Orleans, but it was the largest Italian American community in the country in the 19th century. They came because the oligarchs wanted cheap labor for the plantations and the docks after the liberation of enslaved people in Louisiana. And the Italians were willing to work for basically nothing. So they lived in their little enclaves, and they had their own little businesses, and slowly and slowly they started to prosper. And they intermarried with the Black community, which was really looked down upon. And they became, some of the members became very prominent in New Orleans, including one fella named Joe Machia, who was the head of the whole Italian community. Remember that name, it becomes important. So the oligarchs really started to covet the property and the prosperity of the Italians. They didn't like them. They considered them subhuman anyway. And that they were, consorting with Black people was just proof that they were just not human. So when the really corrupt police chief named Hennessy of New Orleans was assassinated, they took their chance. The mayor ordered his thugs into the Italian community to do like an ice-like sweep, and they arrested hundreds of Italian men. And their instructions were, just arrest anybody who looks like an Italian. They arrested hundreds of them, dragged them out of their beds, chased them down in the streets. And then the mayor had a committee of oligarchs who were supposed to look into what happened. And the oligarchs wrote an open letter to the Italian community. This is not very well known, even among people who know this story. They wrote an open letter to the Italian community and said, turn over your family members, turn over your neighbors, and white people, tell us about any Italian that looks suspicious. And they said, and I'm going to read you what this open letter said, we are going to put an end to this Sicilian crime wave in their city, peaceably and lawfully if we can, violently and summarily if we must. Well, the Italian community was illiterate. And if they were literate, they didn't read English. So this was not for them. This was to gin up the white population and make them realize that the city fathers were going to rid the city of this pest. So the committee gets 19 men indicted, including the most powerful Italian in the community, Joe Machia, who was fluent in English, very prosperous, a city father, member of the Democratic Club, blah, blah, blah. The jury refused to convict any of the Italians. That's how bad the evidence was, because you could convict anybody with dark skin in Louisiana. They wouldn't convict a single one of them. So the oligarchs really hated that, and they ordered the police to take the men back to prison, even though they were not convicted. The next day, the oligarchs put an ad in 28 newspapers in New Orleans. They were calling for a mass meeting of citizens to remedy this miscarriage of justice, and that the mob should be ready for action. So they assembled a mob of 20,000 people. They harangued them with speeches of how they had to rid the city of this pestilence and that the men had to do something. So the men marched on the jail. They broke the doors down with battering rams. They went through the prisoners and selected 11 men, including Joe Maciea, the head of the Italian community. They dragged them out and they lynched them. And then they shot them all in the head. And then they did other terrible things to desecrate them. And then they all went home. And they picked out Joe Maciea because they wanted to send a very clear message to the Italian community that no matter how successful you think you are, you will never be accepted. You will never be one of us. Whenever we want, we will take what we want from you. In the aftermath of that murder, how do you think the country reacted? The country, by and large, celebrated. The headlines all over the country was that Chief Hennessy was avenged, that the mob had done justice when the justice system didn't give them the results that they wanted. 2,000 miles away from Louisiana, the New York Times had a banner headline. It said, Chief Hennessy avenged. 11 of his Italian assassins lynched by a mob, an uprising of indignant citizens in New Orleans. And if you weren't clear that that's what they meant, they issued an editorial 2 days later just to make sure that you really understand what they had to say. And I'm going to read it to you. This is the New York Times. These sneaking and cowardly Sicilians, the descendants of bandits and assassins who have transported to this country the lawless passions, the cutthroat practices, and the oath-bound societies of their native country, are to us a pest without mitigation. Our own rattlesnakes are as good as they. Our own murderers are men of feeling and nobility compared to them. Lynch law was the only course open to the people of New Orleans to stay the issue of a new license to the mafia to continue its bloody practices. It would be very difficult to find one individual who would confess privately he deplores it. This is how the word mafia came into the English language. It became a shorthand for terrorizing the Italian community. All you had to say whenever you had an Italian was mafia, just like saying tren de Aragua now. You know, stop treating the Italians so badly. Like, oh, why? You're protecting the mafia? Did they get justice? The grand jury refused to indict them because mafia. The Italian consul in New Orleans feared for his life. The future president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, had dinner 5 days after the massacre. He wrote to his sister, Monday we dined at the Camerons. Various Dago diplomats were present, which is a swear word for Italians, all much wrought up by the lynching of the Italians in New Orleans. Personally, I think it rather a good thing. And I said so. So that's what the country thought. So to their credit, Italy was not going to have it. They recalled their ambassador and broke off diplomatic relations with the United States. They threatened to blockade the mouth of the Mississippi River. They were preparing to go to war with the United States when they refused to do anything about it. So then the president of the United States, who was Benjamin Harrison, was like, okay, I'll tell you what. I'm going to give you your own special day. We'll call it Columbus Day. So now I'm inviting, I mean, he never said it, but I'm inviting you into the American origin story. No Columbus, no America. Now you're all white. Of course, it didn't work out that way, but that was how we got the first Columbus Day national holiday. I mean, it didn't fix anything. The community in New Orleans was continually terrorized. The Italians were terrorized all over this country. I mean, my family spoke about it in whispers. And if you know your family's history, if you're Italian, you know what I'm saying is true. There was never any justice for those men. They actually paid some reparations to the men's, 3 of the Italian citizens. But there was no justice. This was a generational wound for the Italian American community. And when I celebrate Columbus Day, I mean, it never was about Columbus for me anyway, but I don't celebrate Christopher Columbus. I celebrate my immigrant family that came here with nothing. You know, my grandmother who came as 13 as an indentured servant and built a life for themselves, surrounded by the hate and the terror that stalked New Orleans for decades. I honor what they did, the sacrifices they made for me. I don't honor Christopher Columbus. And to me also, I honor the courage of all of my immigrant ancestors, your immigrant ancestors. You know, the Catholics from Northern Ireland, the Jews from Poland, who knew about persecution and came here with nothing because they wanted a better life for the people that came after them. And now I remember the men who were railroaded and lynched and the community that was terrorized because they came here seeking the same thing that our family sought, which is to live a good life, become Americans, and enjoy the blessings of liberty.
The history of Columbus Day somehow encapsulates all the battles we're still fighting today. I mean, you know, race, power, the way the oligarchs divide people. And then Columbus Day, of course, implicates the genocide of Native Americans. It really goes through the violent, bloody conflicts of this country that we're still fighting right now.
It is. It does. And it has been, the origins have been forgotten, and they really shouldn't be.
In some ways, the irony of the fact that people defending Columbus Day in the name of Christopher Columbus himself are missing out on the fact that the origin of the actual holiday is in remembrance of an immigrant community that was terrorized. And those same people celebrating Columbus are now advocating for the terrorizing of immigrant communities happening right now in America.
I'm very proud of being an Italian American. I am an Italian American to my core. But I think a lot of Italian Americans have forgotten their family histories of what it was like to be an immigrant. And, to their credit, a lot of Italian fraternal organizations have acknowledged what's happened to indigenous people and what's happening now. What happened to the indigenous community is, it's almost impossible to get your mind around. That 90 million people perished after the Spanish conquests, which followed Columbus. That community suffered grievous injuries and wounds. I always said to my family, who really wanted to move beyond what happened to them and forget about it. And I just kept saying, you can't forget about it. You dishonor their memory by forgetting about it. You dishonor their courage. We need to remember and honor what they did. And we need to make the circle of compassion bigger than just our own tribe. And that is very hard for people because a lot of people are afraid that that will be seen as weakness. And it's almost like the memory of the terror that they endured makes them afraid to be compassionate lest somebody take advantage of that. But it's the first step to healing. And I want to say you can have two ideas in your head at once, that what happened to us was wrong and what happened to the indigenous community was really wrong, and that we should be allies in that. I mean, I don't know that Columbus Day really honors Columbus. Any right-thinking person who actually goes on Google and Googles Christopher Columbus will find out the atrocities that he committed. Even for his time, he was a terrible man. He was so terrible that Spain had him arrested and brought back to Spain in chains for the terrible things that he had done. Columbus Day is about the shared journey of every immigrant in this country, to me. And we should make common alliance with people who support indigenous people, because compassion is not a zero-sum thing. The more compassion that you have, the bigger it gets. Anger, it will get you through the night sometimes, but you will never heal with it.
Speaking of healing, this atrocity that was perpetrated against the Italian immigrant community in New Orleans was later recognized by the officials in New Orleans, wasn't it?
128 years after the lynchings, they had mostly been forgotten. Even much of the Italian community that was not in New Orleans had forgotten about it. But not everyone had. The Italian fraternal organizations, in particular, remembered it. And they asked New Orleans to acknowledge it and apologize, and they never did. Oh, that was so long ago. We've all moved on. Let's move on now. That usual thing. And then New Orleans gets a new mayor, a woman, a Black woman, Latoya Cantrell. And the sons and daughters of Italy ask her to look into this. So she looks into it and she said, you know what? This was wrong. And New Orleans is going to apologize for it. And if you think that apologies don't mean anything, that they're meaningless gestures, I'm going to tell you that Italian Americans flew in to New Orleans from all over the United States to be present for that moment. And her speech was broadcast in Italy.
On March 14th, 1891, 11 Italians were made the victims of a lynch mob on the streets right here in the city of New Orleans. The city government at that time declined to seek justice for our people, and in fact was implicated in the violence. What happened to those 11 Italians, it was wrong, and the city owes them and their descendants a formal apology.
And the lawyer who had officially asked for it, Mr. Michael Santo, said, I really was in awe. There are a lot of ways she could have reacted, but she reacted with such grace and dignity and conviction that it really floored us. And his reaction is not surprising to me because the community was so protective of itself. I don't think it ever expected compassion from someone who's descended from people who also suffered grievous injuries in this country. That apology mattered because it was the beginning of healing, because it was a generational wound. It needed someone to stand up and say, what happened was wrong. And every single night in this country, right now, immigrants are cowering in their homes and they are being terrorized by America's new secret police, which is just the old secret police, like the mob that the mayor sent 128 years ago into New Orleans to round up anybody who looked like they were Italian. And they are breaking down their doors and dragging people out of their homes, just like they did 128 years ago. Except now they have a badge and a machine gun and a mask. I'm just an ordinary person, trying to do some good in this world. But I can't stand this. This is the same thing we are trying to remember in Columbus Day that is happening to them. And I don't want that community to have to wait 128 years for someone to say, I'm really sorry what happened to you. Nobody stood up for those men 128 years ago. Nobody stopped it, but we can stop it. We can stop it. And I don't care if you're Protestant or Catholic or conservative or liberal or Republican or Democrat. I grew up in a very conservative Republican family, and I swear to you that my very conservative Republican Italian mother, your grandmother, would be out on the streets with me with an American flag and getting in the faces of those ICE people and saying, you can't do this to people. This is not the America that I want for my children. And so what I'm going to say to everyone out there, we are the only ones who can stop this. The politicians are cowering before the tyrant, but they also are afraid of us. Get your American flag and come out on October 18th. Just say, no, we do not accept this. Nobody stood up for those men 128 years ago, and that is not going to happen now.
Amen, Mom. Thank you for making me cry on Columbus Day. I appreciate it. Never thought I would. All right, Mom. I think that's a great place to leave it. I love you so much.
Love you too.
All right. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm actually going to include my mom on the little end tag for this one because, Mom, you and I just passed our 1-year anniversary. We've been doing this little show for officially the first post a year ago. What do you want to say to our audience on this special occasion?
Oh my God. When we posted that first video, I thought that, if I really harassed my very large extended family, I could get, 100 views by Christmas. I thought that would be really good. So I was just completely flabbergasted when it passed 180,000. I just thought, who would listen to me? All I can say is, thank you. I hope it means something to you, because it means a lot to me.
All right. Thanks, Mom. We'll see you all next time.